Well, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to talk about CBAM. Now, CBAM has been a popular discussion amongst many of you for many weeks now, and there's so much confusion, so much interest, and so many questions that we have received talking about CBAM. So, we put together a presentation on CBAM for you that you can access right now. And I wanted to introduce this presentation to you so you know that what we're going to be talking about. So let's go. So I've just come out of a wonderful 1 hour webinar on unpacking CBAM, which I was so fortunate enough to carry out with my good friend and colleague Enrika from CustomsClear. And she's been receiving so many questions on CBAM as well. So I thought, well, why don't we join forces and talk about CBAM? Now, what's really great in this 1 hour webinar, we talked about CBAM from various different aspects with a focus on customs, the customs aspect, the question of who does what and why and what's the role of customs professionals, import and export managers in CBAM. And together we gave two very interesting presentations. Enrika, in her first about 10-15 minute intervention, talked about the context in which the CBAM operates, the question of sustainability, the question of what is the role of a customs manager, a customs professional today in the EU, the European Union, with regards to CBAM, but also other legislation that takes the idea of sustainability and enlarges or expands, I should say, its definition. And that includes now considerations that deal with imports in particular. So what a customs, though her conclusion was what a customs manager was before the Green Revolution is no longer what a customs manager is next year and the following years, because the scope of what customs now needs to be able to do is changing and changing significantly. There is much more that a customs professional now needs to know, and CBAM is just one example. So in this webinar, we talked about unpacking CBAM. I want to share some slides with you to tell you what it is that we covered. So first in this webinar, Enrika gave us more background, more information about sustainability in the European Union and why that now matters so much to customs professionals. Then she explained the CBAM fundamentals, I would say, that you need to know about. She then went on to say, well, this is the context in which CBAM operates, and this is who's going to do what, and this is why customs is involved. This is why a customs manager today can't simply say, it's not for me. I'm closing. This is not customs. This is border carbon tax emission calculation. It's not as simple as that. You need, as a customs professional, you need to understand CBAM and understand what it means for your company, or if you're an advisor, a consultant for your clients. So I then was tasked to take this to the next level. And here is what we did and we didn't talk about in this webinar. We were not explaining what CBAM is and what the purpose of it is, because you can read this anywhere. And besides, by now, given that CBAM is already in operation, if you don't know what it is about, well, you've got bigger issues to deal with than the practical implementation. You've got to go back to the very beginning. And for this, you can look at pertinent website. Just a Google search will sort you out. So we're not going to talk about this because there's everywhere. Secondly, we're not going to talk about ETS, and we're not going to talk about carbon border emission calculations. Yes, there's a lot that we need to unpack here, but that's something that we can do at a later stage in a specific training. There, we need more time. We need about 4 hours for a complete overview of CBAM, and this is where we look into carbon emissions calculations as well. That's also not the primary focus for importers and those in the EU anyway, because you're not going to do the calculations. We're also not going to repeat what the EU Commission has said in its webinar. So there's a lot of information already produced by the EU Commission, and you should definitely check this out. There are webinars on each of the different products concerned. And so if you are in a certain product, you should check out that webinar. But it's a very condensed version, 1 hour only, on these regulations. And some have found it a little bit challenging to follow because they're going quite quick. And the challenge also lies in the fact that those watching it may be one of the two, but not both. What I mean is, you may be a carbon emission calculation expert and in this environmental space, or you may be a customs professional who deals with classification, origin, valuation, and the likes of it. If that is so, congratulations, but you wouldn't know how to calculate carbon emissions. And equally, if you know how to calculate carbon emissions, you wouldn't know how to do import, export, and all that other business. So whatever you do, you need to upskill yourself in either the first or the second or both. And that's the challenge. So we're not going to talk about that part that the Commission's already covered. What we will cover in this webinar, though, is a basic understanding of what we need to know. And here we focus. We don't want to know everything. We want to know what's important for importers in the EU. We're going to unpack CBAM. We're going to look at the official route. We're going to look at who's concerned by CBAM. And that goes not only to, am I importing CBAM goods, but it also talks about who in the organization should be concerned. And what about you yourself, you watching this? What's your role? Imagine you're an import manager and now they're bolting on CBAM onto you. That can't work because you're already using all your time in the day to do imports. So we got to understand who is actually responsible in a company for CBAM. We got to understand who the different parties are. We got to understand what we need to report. We got to understand who's going to do what, and we got to understand what's the issue with penalties. And there is a lot more that we need to unpack. Yes, so we're going to talk about all of this in this webinar that you can access right now. And so the first question is, what is it that I need to know? We have carried out extensive 4 hours worth of CBAM trainings several times now in cooperation with CustomsClear, and we collected feedback. And the feedback we collected was that reading legislation alone is not helpful, because the legislation goes into everything, and some may be relevant and some may not. And also other feedback is that, yeah, you have already watched the EU Commission's webinar, but now you're more confused than before because there is so much detail in so little time. So I myself watched these webinars 3 times, stopped, paused, rewind, looked at the calculations. It's quite complex. So we thought, well, we've got to do another webinar where we put this into context. And that's precisely what we're going to do in this webinar. We're going to contextualize and we're going to unpack with a focus, not everything. We're going to focus on the essentials for importers or customs professionals or customs advisors. In fact, even brokers, agents, customs agents might find this very relevant. And one of the feedbacks that we got is we need to put it into context for customs professionals, for importers, and we need to find out what's relevant here. So in this webinar, we are going to talk about 4 things, the key focuses that you've asked us to talk about. Question 1, am I concerned by CBAM? Question 2, what do importers have to do? Question 3, what do agents have to do? What do my suppliers abroad need to do? In other words, who does what? Well, once you know who has to do what, the question next is do what? So I'm assuming you're responsible. What are you going to do? What is it that you need to do? And what if you are so into the details that you actually get lost? You don't know anymore where you are. How do you backtrack if you get lost? And then, of course, if once you know who does what the focus is, what do you need to do? The question then becomes, by when? So when do I need to do something? Or when does someone need to do something? So you can see already with this kind of focus, you will get much further than if you read the whole thing and spend hours like I actually had to do. But that allows me also that deep dive into various regulations. And so it allows me to narrow it down, which I think is quite nice. I want to show you 3 more things that people have told us. So the first is this funnel approach, where we answer questions like who does what do you do, and when do you do it, and what should be the focus. And there are 3 more things that people have commented on that they needed to know about CBAM. And we have really unpicked this in this webinar. The role of the person responsible for CBAM in the importing country. Enrika will talk about this a lot. I will pick it up again. Who is that? And then once you figure that out, the communication with suppliers is going to be quite crucial because you need to convince them to provide you CBAM details. So we need to talk about how you're best going to go about talking to your suppliers. And then thirdly, what if you need help? What if you got a customs or a legislation question? And the challenge here is what I've said previously. You can't go to a customs expert because they might not know CBAM. And you can't go to a CBAM or carbon emission expert because they don't know customs. So where is the person that knows both, right? And is there a place where you can exchange best practices? So all of that we're going to cover in this webinar. So you see, there is a lot to unpack. There is a lot to talk about. 1 hour is barely enough to scrape the surface, but it will get us going the right way. And once we've got that hour and we talked about CBAM, we can then go on to the next stage, which is a 4-hour more detailed training on CBAM, which is also on offer. Obviously, please check out the relevant websites on customsmanager.org. And then there is the spaces of support where you can get specific company-specific support to help you with lodging your first, second, third, whatever CBAM report onto the CBAM registry. Hey, I have talked enough about CBAM now. I hope you're going to join us for this 1-hour presentation, this 1-hour webinar. The link on how you get it is, of course, down below. I'd love to see you there. So thank you very much for your attention, and let's get into the webinar, shall we?